Thank you, Jan, and thank you to the panelists for this interesting and very active discussion. Now, our day will be concluded with a keynote from the Vice President on European Government Affairs of Microsoft, Mr. Casper Klynge. The discussion with Mr. Klynge will be held by our international law researcher, Tatjana Yanchakova. Please, Tanya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Henrik. Ladies and gentlemen, indeed, a good time of the day to your respective time zones. As Henrik has hinted, I have the pleasure today to welcome Mr. Casper Klynge, Microsoft's Vice President for European Government Affairs. Before joining Microsoft, Mr. Klynge has had gained notoriety as Denmark's and the world's first tech ambassador, connecting thus domains of diplomacy and the big tech. He therefore has a unique insight into the mindset of tech industry while understanding the concerns governments might have when reconciling technological advancement and values they are tasked to protect. In this session, Mr. Klynge will set the ground with his opening remarks, upon which we will continue in a more interactive manner and hopefully have an interesting conversation on artificial intelligence, its responsible use in defense context. You are all warmly invited to contribute with your questions via the chat function on the conference webpage. Mr. Klynge, welcome. The floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thanks very much, Tatjana, and thanks for the warm welcome today. And let me begin by saying, I think what everybody else have been feeling and saying earlier today, it's such a shame that we cannot be together for what I think is a really timely discussion today. But hopefully next year we'll come together as well. Listen, as I said, I think it is fantastic that you put on the topic on the agenda for today a discussion about sort of NATO's involvement in new technologies, the role of the technology industry, and I might be able to repeat a couple of points that I heard in the previous discussion. I think it's timely, and as we've seen also during the last 14, 15 months, technology is penetrating or transcending every single sector that we're involved in, so I think it's only natural that we're beginning this discussion also focusing on NATO's role. I actually wanted to go back to December 2019 and the London summit of NATO that I remember quite clearly. And the reason I remember it is that I think the declaration we saw coming forward on emerging and disruptive technologies was NATO basically looking into the crystal ball and I think taking a very strategic and important step forward in recognizing that also the strongest defense alliance of this world will need to increasingly focusing on what technologies will do, both in terms of opportunities, but certainly also in terms of challenges. And I think what we all realize today, regardless of whether we work on the private sector side or in governments or in international organizations like NATO, is that technology has a fundamental impact on international relations, on geopolitics, but also really on the foundation of our societies, defending democracy, etc. So I think it's fantastic that we have this discussion today. I also want to welcome recent steps taken by NATO, and in this regard, I'm of course talking about the upcoming strategy on artificial intelligence. And this is perhaps the topic I will try and focus a little bit on in the introductory remarks today, because I think it is a technology that is going to have a significant impact on our societies, but also on the alliance. I think the first point to make, as others have done earlier today, is that artificial intelligence or machine learning is, of course, a technology that can be used for many good things, but it can also be used as a weapon, as a tool against us. And I think striking that balance and making sure that we approach artificial intelligence in a responsible way is in many ways one of the key challenges of our time. I think when you look at it from a defense point of view or in a conflict concept, one of the key things that we look at from an industry point of view is, of course, how AI is going to help us also mitigate some of the key challenges of our time. And I just want to point out on the cybersecurity agenda that this is certainly an area where artificial intelligence already today is playing a remarkable role in trying to mitigate the threat that is coming towards us from both state and non-state actors. If you look at a company like Microsoft, we have in fact, as of today, automated, almost 97% of our routine tasks using machine learning and artificial intelligence. And we have also become much better at detecting some of the attacks that are coming in the direction. So that makes us better at being the first responders in defending our customers, but also defending the public sector from one of the key challenges of today. One of the ways that it is enabling us to use artificial intelligence is, of course, our cloud-first strategy. The fact that the cloud offers unique and unprecedented opportunities for using, large-scale data sets and using AI and ML for better defending the systems that we have out and about today. So one of the points that we, of course, wanted to make is that, a cloud strategy, in our view, is a fundamental aspect of utilizing the opportunities that AI is bringing forward. And then, Tatiana, you might get a question from the audience, do we have interest in Microsoft in promoting a cloud-first strategy? And the answer is, of course, yes, we do. We are one of the hyperscale providers of this world, but I would still say that we would advocate a cloud strategy any day of the week, also if those cloud opportunities would fall into the hands of our competitors. As we've seen with some of the latest cyber attacks, on-premise rather than in cloud actually provides less security and makes it more difficult also for us to defend our customers' sensitive data, etc. But I think we also have to recognize, as others have mentioned in the previous discussion, that there is an arms race out here. AI and ML can also be used by the aggressors, by the adversaries, for launching increasingly sophisticated attacks. And we've seen just in the last 6 months attacks like SolarWinds. We've seen the recent Hafnium attack. And I think those are good reminders that artificial intelligence is not only going to be used as a tool to defend our systems and defend our societies, it's also going to be used by the perpetrators to launch increasingly complicated attacks. And that, I think, brings us to the discussion of why it is that NATO needs to focus and invest more on artificial intelligence, and why I think, again, that the upcoming AI strategy is such a welcome step forward. I think ultimately for NATO, this is about retaining superiority in a world that is becoming increasingly driven by technology. And I think it is absolutely necessary for NATO to focus on a concept like artificial intelligence. If you want me to be a little bit provocative, and I apologize in advance for doing that, I think we've seen the European Union, we've seen the United Nations actually investing quite a lot in looking into the crystal ball, trying to find strategies for adopting and handling the new technologies that are coming forward. So to some extent, the question is not whether NATO should do it. I think the question is why NATO has not done it before. And I'm saying this, of course, in a friendly way of teasing NATO a little bit, but fundamentally saying that I think it's high noon and very timely that NATO is investing a lot in looking at a technology like artificial intelligence. I think finding the responsible way of looking at AI is also an area where NATO has a unique opportunity, both to make sure that also in the battlefield, when we deal with this in the defense area, that AI is used in a responsible way. But then I think the advantage of NATO that also for a company like Microsoft is incredibly important is that this is also a way of keeping the transatlantic relationship together and making sure that we also across the Atlantic have a clear focus on, again, the opportunities of these new technologies, but also developing them in a way forward that is responsible. And the last thing I would say is that I think when you look at the broader framework of NATO looking at emerging and disruptive technologies, I think one of the advantages here is that gives the opportunity to create or perhaps even create a new opportunity in creating a dialogue between the industry and NATO, perhaps even creating an interface of a continued dialogue between NATO and the industry. I think for us in Microsoft, that is something that we would warmly welcome. we are struggling with finding the right way forward on responsible use of AI every single day, but actually having a dialogue with NATO, looking at ethical principles coming out of NATO would enable not only us working closer together with NATO, but I think it would also open up opportunities for the wider ecosystem of innovative technology companies to really align with NATO. So wrapping up sort of the introductory remark here, I think, first of all, fantastic we're seeing NATO move into this area. Secondly, we want to be a partner with NATO. We want to help both develop the strategy, but also make sure that our technology can come forward in a responsible way, in a helpful way to the alliance. And therefore, we would strongly advocate, as the previous speaker also did, that perhaps time is ripe for us to create sort of a multi-stakeholder framework where the industry can come closer together with NATO in solving some of the big issues of our time. I'll leave it at that to begin with, but thanks again for giving me the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Klynge. I like the level of introspection when you spoke about Microsoft being primary supplier for cloud services and you're interested in it. However, let me take you even further down the memory lane. In 2017, actually, Microsoft's president, Brett Smith, in his Tools and Weapons book, recalls a meeting in Davos, I believe in 2017, where a discussion on artificial intelligence was in full swing, yet it was clear that half of the audience didn't really have an idea of what artificial intelligence was, and at the same time were too shy to ask. So I wonder, since this is a very timely and substantively charged debate, do you get the impression from your discussions with governments and military representatives that this extent of let's say, the level of awareness has changed for the better today? Are we all on the same page today when we speak about artificial intelligence and its responsible use?
I think it would probably be going too far to say we're on the same page, because even for those of us working within one of the most innovative companies of this world, I think keeping up with our engineers and understanding where this technology is heading and the usability of this technology is just incredibly difficult, and it perhaps shows the pace of development of these technologies, which again might be unprecedented. But I do want to be a little bit positive in this area, because I do think that when we look at the last sort of 14, 15 months with the global pandemic, one of the areas where we've seen a massive change is, of course, the acceleration of digitalisation, at least here in Europe. And for whatever it's worth, I think in my own dialogue with European governments, with European stakeholders, with NATO member states, with the European Commission, as well as many, many other stakeholders across Europe, I think there is a better understanding today of the role of technology, the importance of technology. And I would actually take that one step forward in saying that I do think that the basic concepts around machine learning and artificial intelligence is better understood today. And some of it because of interest in looking at the opportunities this might create for our societies, for our small and medium-sized enterprises, but of course also because there is I think, a better understanding today that these technologies are potentially going to have a dramatic impact on our societies, on our economy, on the job creation. But I would also say, moving into a NATO context, in the way that we look at the defense alliance and the way we look at how we defend our societies, our democracies. So I do think there is a better understanding of those concepts today. Do I think we are where we need to be? No, I don't. And that is one of the reasons why I think what is particularly important in today's world, and looking at where we are here in 2021, governments cannot do it alone. The international industry cannot do it alone. As you mentioned very kindly in your introductory remark, I used to work on the government side in NATO and in the European Union. Now I've moved to the other side of the table in one of the big technology companies, but I remain still today convinced that we have to make sure that we have a much closer dialogue today, that we better understand what is happening on the industry side. We have to make sure that we provide our insights and our experts are able to share with governments and international organization what is coming in their way. And I think on the industry side, we have to double down in better understanding both the concerns of governments, the interest of international organization in using the new technologies. So still a little bit to go, but from I think a slightly better starting point today than even just a few years ago.
Well, that's great to hear that the trend is positive, because indeed, as you have mentioned, the upcoming NATO summit aspires, among other, to discuss a new NATO artificial intelligence strategy, inscribing into a broader debate on emerging and disruptive technologies. Also within the NATO 2030 initiative, several proposals have been made with regard to artificial intelligence. While we have yet to see to what extent they will be taken on board, it would be interesting to hear your take on the direction NATO should take in respect of those proposals. And do you feel that industry's views have been listened to during the process?
Yeah, let me say yes to the last bit of it, because I do think there has been a lot of dialogue, a lot of consultations going on. I've had the pleasure myself to be involved in a couple of discussions also with the Secretariat looking at developing the new upcoming AI strategy. And I think that's exactly the way forward. And I think that is the right way forward for a number of reasons. First of all, because it gives us the opportunity to share what we know on the new technologies, but also on a topic like cybersecurity discussed previously. I think one of the big differences, as I mentioned earlier on, is that in today's world, the private industry to some extent operate the digital infrastructure, but we're also the first responders when we see, for example, attacks on critical infrastructure in NATO member states or across Europe. So I think that dialogue is incredibly important. But I think it is also important for us to listen very carefully to, in this case, NATO or NATO member states. What are the concerns expressed by NATO member states? What are the opportunities that they see in using the new technologies? What are the concerns about going to the cloud? What can we do more to develop and deploy technology that is aligned with, in this case, what NATO is looking for? So my hope is, of course, that heads of states and government will be looking at this in a few weeks' time, and they will really try and develop and give a clear mandate also to NATO to expand the activities focusing on emerging and disruptive technologies. And if you want me to give a little bit of a wish in NATO's direction, and I don't think anybody will listen very carefully to this, but I think any wording that would indicate that NATO is interested in sort of formalizing a dialogue with the technology industry, I think would be a very welcoming step forward. And it would also put a bit of responsible burden on the shoulders of the industry to engage in a more formalized way with NATO. So that's a little bit the wish list looking a few weeks ahead.
Thank you very much. You provided a good opening to my following question. Apart from this wish for closer relationship between governments and NATO and industry, what would be, or what maybe have been, other recommendations of the industry for responsible AI strategy based on Microsoft's clearly vast experience around AI? Where do you see the greatest risk and the greatest opportunities or potential for responsible use?
Yeah, I think as an industry and as one of the key technology providers, we have to operate in a complex situation right now. We're beginning to look at regulations coming forward. I think one of the previous speakers mentioned the draft proposal of the European Union on artificial intelligence. I think that's a landmark regulatory proposal that contains a lot of good elements, including focusing on high-risk areas as the area that really needs to be regulated a bit more. I think also when you look at what we've done internally in Microsoft, that is to make sure that we take into account from the very outset, how we develop systems that are responsible. We now have an Office for Responsible AI. We make sure that when our engineers are developing the systems of tomorrow, that ethical principles, responsible principles for AI, that is taken into account from the very outset. And I think that's a slightly different approach to developing these new technologies. But I would also say that I think that framework, and perhaps even the framework of the European Union, are areas where NATO perhaps could get a bit of inspiration, but because it goes without saying that as we move into the defense domain, those are areas that are currently, of course, not covered by the EU regulation, and where I also think that in the industry we would welcome some principles, some guidelines, a clearly defined strategy on what we can do again to develop and deploy technologies that will cater for the specific requirements of NATO. And I think there are unlimited opportunities also for NATO, everything from building out better cybersecurity defense systems to logistics to, battlefield management systems. All of these areas would definitely be areas where artificial intelligence can or are already playing a significant role. But creating the framework on the responsible use of AI, I think would set a very, very strong signal or message, and it would also, I think, mark the territory on where NATO can come across as being the responsible defense alliance that we all have to align with.
Thank you. I'm glad that you mentioned the various use cases or possibilities of use for artificial intelligence, so that it's clear that AI is not only about killer robots, but in fact it can be used in many other contexts as well. However, about regulation of AI, it indeed has been the talk for some time, and recently has gained on speed with the European Commission proposing the draft regulation on artificial intelligence. While it explicitly excludes military use from its scope, it will undoubtedly have an impact on technologies used in and by NATO member states, also for defense purposes, because not only about military purpose. And I wonder, maybe from industry's perspective, and especially if you're keen on innovation, if you're keen on new ideas, how and flexibility, is legal regulation and binding rules really the way to go? Will EU not achieve quite the opposite, and maybe, if not hamper, then at least slow down innovation, perhaps for the benefit of other countries that do not push for binding rules, or even to the benefit of the adversary?
Liz, I think that's the sort of million or perhaps billion-dollar question that everybody is asking, Tatjana, and I can give you sort of my perspective on it. And the first thing I want to say is to correct one misunderstanding that I think quite often that I see quite often sort of referred to, and that is that in the industry we are against regulation per se. That is simply not the case, and in Microsoft we've been advocating for stronger regulation around AI for years. We've been talking about the necessity, for example, on facial recognition systems to have strong regulations in place to avoid misuse of those technologies. But I think also in terms of avoiding, in the lighter scale of things, biases in facial recognition systems, which means that when you're a middle-aged white man like me, those systems are working relatively well. If you're a woman or a person of color, then those systems are much less effective today. We know that, that's a matter of fact. And actually making sure that we have regulation in place that prevents systems from being developed with those biases, I think would be absolutely necessary. Now, looking at what is happening in the European Union, as I said before, I actually think that the regulation is a very balanced way forward that identifying high-risk areas, areas where it's about your fundamental rights. It's about making sure that, if you go to a job interview, that you're not screened in an inappropriate way and thereby disregarded in the beginning. It's about making sure that facial recognition systems are not misused. So it's about protecting fundamental, serious, high-risk rights for citizens. That would be absolutely necessary. I think where Europe and the European Union, as well as any other country around the world, will have to sort of make sure you find the right balance is exactly on what you were saying, Tatjana. Avoiding this becoming sort of a straitjacket, a regulatory straitjacket that will prevent innovation. And, I'm a European, as you can hear from my accent. Apologies for that. And I do think that, of course, in Europe, we are increasingly concerned about whether Europe will remain competitive on a global stage, where the technology development is moving very quickly, not least in the United States. and in Asia, and particularly in China. So for whatever it's worth, when I speak to European decision makers, I think those are one of the main concerns. How do we make sure that Europe will be relevant in the next decade as well? How will we make sure that Europe will create an ecosystem of innovation that will be competitive on the global stage? And I have noticed after the draft proposal coming forward from the European Commission that there has been voices, not least among the startup environment, among entrepreneurs, among small and medium-sized enterprises, saying, there are some concerns of whether, new regulation would make it more difficult for them to innovate, for example, in the area of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I think we are in the middle of a consultation process where I'm absolutely sure that the European Commission is going to pay a lot of attention to that, because we don't have any interest in making sure that the regulations coming out will primarily be easier for larger companies to adhere to that. I think we want to make sure that the new regulations will also help spark a lot of innovation in Europe, not least in the area of AI. And why do we want that? Well, we see ourselves as being a provider of, I would say, the foundation productivity tools, critical infrastructure that enable European companies to benefit, to innovate, to create the framework that will enable them to reap the full benefits of the digital age. And I think we want to make sure that the new regulations will go in that direction. And I'm pretty sure that everybody inside the European Commission are complete in agreement with these points, and we'll be looking at that during the consultation process.
Me as a lawyer, I'm very glad to hear this perspective, I must admit. And indeed, we have seen in the cyberspace norms discussion that actually industry, with Microsoft at a prominent place, has been the norms entrepreneur in some cases. So this might be something to be expected in AI domain as well. We'll see. I hear from my colleagues that we're having a lot of questions from the audience. So if I manage to read them, then our audience would like to ask, Mr. Klynge, how can Microsoft and other big tech companies better cooperate and support NATO and allies' efforts in operationalizing AI applications for opportunities in military defense and cybersecurity?
Yeah, it's a good question, and definitely a question that we've been trying to address already. I think one of the basic starting points is this closer dialogue between NATO and the industry. And as I said earlier on, I think we've taken some pretty important steps forward in creating a closer interface. I think the question is whether we take that to the next level and create sort of a more formalized structure. As we've seen again, in the European Union, we've seen under the High Representative a tech panel being set up that sort of is set up to make sure that there is a dialogue between decision makers in the External Action Service, so the foreign policy angle of the European Union, and the industry. And if we go back a few years, we saw the United Nations and the Secretary General set down a panel on digital cooperation that again we're trying to look at where the world is heading and how the United Nations can align with that future. And I think, again, I'm not objective, and I realize that this will be sort of my personal view on this, but I think, honestly, time is ripe for us to do something similar with NATO. And I think the benefit of that would be that it would enable us to share our experiences, our insights, including on how you develop artificial intelligence systems that are responsible. It would also enable us to better understand and hear the concerns of NATO, or the areas where they think the industry needs to come together as one. But fundamentally, I think where NATO can make a real difference is when you look at the military domain or the defense domain. Having an organization like NATO, setting a very clear signal in wanting to move ahead in a way where you take full advantage also for the superiority of the alliance in the new technologies coming forward, but doing that in a responsible way. I think it would not only benefit NATO member states, it would also set a precedent or create the norms that you spoke about before that others will adhere to. In other words, I think there will be a ripple of effects for the rest of the world, which I think is incredibly important when you look at where the world is today, and when you look at the threats coming forward, not least from a cybersecurity point of view.
Thank you very much. Then we have a more of a factographical question, and I don't actually know whether you're allowed to answer that, but let's see. How was AI used in the SolarWinds and Hafnium attacks?
I think I can give you sort of a general response to that, and I've already alluded to the fact that I think in Microsoft, we have more than 3,000 people working 24/7 in creating the best possible defense against the what I would call very unethical, very irresponsible cyber attacks that we are seeing, unfortunately around the clock. And I just want to add, even when we look back at the global pandemic, a very difficult situation for, I think, all societies around the world, we did not see a moratorium come forward on cyber attacks. In fact, we saw some of the perpetrators attack, healthcare organizations, frontline workers in our healthcare system. So this is definitely an area that will unfortunately not disappear. And we are using AI systems every single day to try and make sure that our customers, whether in the private sector or in the public sector, have access to state-of-the-art technology that will hopefully create the best possible defense against these attacks. But I also want to be honest in saying that this is not something that ends tomorrow or the day after. This is an arms race where the sophistication and the complexity of the attacks, unfortunately, are developing as well. So we need to constantly innovate, constantly use new technology to do our utmost to defend our societies. And this is, of course, one of the areas, again, going back to the norms discussion, where creating sort of a shared sense of the traffic rules in cyberspace, pointing out what is irresponsible behavior in cyberspace, is where that discussion ties very neatly together with what we do as an industry, but also what I think we need to expect from countries and actors around the world.
Thank you very much. The next question: what is Microsoft's commitment to giving the cloud infrastructure into the hands of independent European operators, relinquishing access to customer metadata?
Well, if we're sitting in Europe, and I think if we look at the discussion that is happening in Europe right now around strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty, that is a discussion that certainly has an impact on the technology industry. And it has raised a lot of concerns about whether Europe is turning inward-looking, whether this is sort of a new sign of protectionism coming forward in Europe. That's not the way that we look at it in Microsoft. In fact, we look at it as some very valid and legitimate discussions around making sure that Europe will remain, in charge, will remain, in a position to take decisions independently. And I think Commissioner Vestager of the European Union has defined it as sort of regulatory sovereignty. In other words, that the European Union will continue to be able to define the rules that applies in Europe. And when you look at the cloud market, you have various initiatives coming forward, new regulation inside the European Union. You also have an initiative like GAIA-X, creating a sort of a federated cloud structure in Europe. And I think all of that is really aimed at making sure that Europe will benefit to the fullest extent of cloud opportunities. And as I said before, in my view, which is certainly not objective, but I do want to make the point nonetheless, I think cloud computing is not something that is nice to have. I think it is a need to have today. It's a fundamental aspect if you want to make it in a digitalized world. And it actually creates benefits. I mentioned before, increasing cybersecurity. I want to add, sustainability as another area where we know there are huge efficiencies by going to the cloud for companies as well as the private sector. I think for us in Microsoft, listening to the debate in Europe, also around sovereignty, one of the clear lessons is we have to make sure that we align our technologies with what Europe wants and the European aspirations. So one of the things we've done in Microsoft is to come up with a concept we call Tech Fit for Europe. And it's basically a recognition that whether you look at data residency, whether you look at concerns about access to data sets, we have to do everything we can to make sure that we develop technologies that are fully aligned with what Europe wants. So Europe fit for the digital age. And I do think that looking back at a very, very challenging year or 15 months, the dependencies on technologies that has made sure that we have hopefully come through the crisis in a better way than without access to those technologies. That has also revealed the dependency of those technologies, which in my view makes it even more necessary for us to really align with the European agenda. And I think you can basically use the same mindset when looking at NATO. And again, I just want to make the point once again that I think it is reassuring, but it is also really welcoming that NATO is now so deeply focusing on emerging and disruptive technologies as well as AI systems, artificial intelligence systems. And we want to be a partner in that. We want to listen to NATO. We want to make sure that we align with where NATO is going and where NATO wants to go.
Thank you very much. You mentioned you've gone back to NATO. Traditionally, one last question. Traditionally, interoperability has been one of the biggest challenges for NATO member states. How do you see challenges in AI, in respect of AI applications, in terms of interoperability?
But I think those are sort of the criteria that NATO needs to put down. In other words, if you want to provide technology to NATO, interoperability is going to be one of the key parameters. I don't think that's different in the hardware world of NATO, and I don't think that will be the case in the software part either. But I think it's one of those areas, again, where we will have to listen very carefully. We want to have a dialogue with NATO. We want to better understand where NATO wants to go, and then we will have to align our technologies with that situation, and we are completely prepared to do that.
That's great. Well, tomorrow we will hear from NATO Undersecretary for Emerging Security Challenges, so maybe we can start having the conversation already and maybe get some answers as of tomorrow to the point we've raised today. Thank you very much, Mr. Klynge, for being with us today. You've provided a very interesting perspective on the issues on the matter of artificial intelligence and its use by NATO. I thank you again for being with us today. I hope to see you again in the future in person in Tallinn. And with this, I'm giving the floor back to our lovely hosts. Thank you very much.
So, thank you, Casper and Tanya, for providing us with yet another insightful and stimulating discussion, which certainly gave us some food for thought.
That brings us to the conclusion of day one. All that remains for us is to thank you all for your active participation. And we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow, starting at the same time as today.